Well, hello everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm extremely excited to be here with Jesse Donovan, who has been a long-standing member of BuyOrBorrow and at this point a friend. I've gotten to know Jesse very well. And what I find very interesting about Jesse is that he is a true audio scientist. And if you want to know what that means, I'm going to let him tell you a little bit in a second. But he is very accomplished in composing and production, and is probably one of the most knowledgeable studio gear nerds that I know. So I'm very fortunate to be with him here today. Jesse, I'm going to let you give a quick intro and then we're going to get right into the discussion.
All right, thanks, Dave. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Glad we got to finally get together. Um, I'm just gonna be here to kind of answer some questions. Dave will rein me in because I can ramble on for ages. But audio science, just the science of sound, acoustics, physics, everything that goes into it, electronics engineering. I've always really dug into that stuff since I was a kid. And that plays right into composition and production, and all those things matter when you're putting a piece of music together, regardless of the genre. If the production isn't there in pre-production composition, those tracks are never going to line up and get along together, and your mix is going to not really come out that well. So everything considered, we'll be talking about anything from microphone, speakers, all that. So I'll let Dave guide me so we can jump into the meat of it.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, the first thing I want to do is double click into audio scientist because you got me very interested when you first used that term, and I would love our listeners to know a little bit more about it. So let's talk about how do you define it, and then maybe tell us how you got into it. What's your journey been?
I mean, it's not something that you're gonna go, oh, let me go to MIT and get a degree in audio science.
Right.
But it's, I've had a strong scientific background, music background. I've got my degree in music and with a lot of different focuses, primarily centered initially and officially around piano performance, but I am a multi instrumentalist. I consider myself to be pretty much on the same page with piano, drums, and vocals. And then I play guitar and bass a lot, and then I play a lot of different instruments. But it comes down to kind of, I think about my first violin lesson. I had been teaching myself for a little while, and then the first chair of the Charlotte Symphony Orchestra sat me down and was like, stop everything you're doing. I was like 14 or 15. He was like, okay, let's take the instrument apart. He's like, this is a box that resonates. Let's see how it works. This is, he described every little piece. And in this extended amount of time that he wasn't even supposed to spend with me in this lesson, he taught me everything that I needed to know about the violin to start a new adventure with it. Now I'm not an accomplished violinist, but it taught me a lot for composing for violin, and I did play violin in different capacities. But my point is kind of that tearing things down, like being underneath the structure so that you have understanding. You're standing under it, you can see the foundations, you can see what it's made of. And that was always a point of curiosity for me, taking things apart, learning how they work, building my own. So that's where eventually it led me to, you know, decades of modding speakers and microphones, eventually designing my own because I saw holes where, sure, there are companies that do things above and beyond what I have the gear to do, but I have designed speakers that I work with regularly in my studio, that nobody else has because I built them for myself. Um, and a couple of friends of mine have asked me to do little mods and stuff for them, and I've done that. But yeah, so audio science is just kind of getting to the foundation of whatever it is that you're doing in the process of creating music, making sound, creating sound effects, sound design, all of that goes into it. I mean, it's nothing special that separates me from any other producer per se, but it's just something that I've been called, and eventually a moniker that I took on for myself because I'm a super nerd. I've been in IT, I've been in electronics engineering and different fields that have brought me, I have a love for science having to do with medical science, physics, quantum mechanics, theoretical physics, stuff like that really interests me. I'm not an expert in any of those fields, but it pulls it together, and I basically have the scientific method at the foundation of everything that I'm doing. But I balance that also with the creativity to just close your eyes and listen and see, is this really working? Because they're kind of two sides to that coin, and they both matter.
Well, and ultimately, I think what you have here is left brain, right brain in a way that not a lot of people do, which is a lot of fun. So let's zoom in on the science. I want to talk about mics because I
Okay.
know that's something that you are very knowledgeable about and have had a lot of experience with, as you said, modifying mics, building some of your own. I know you've used some really high-end stuff, the Neumann type mics, in your
Yeah.
studio. So let's zoom in there and maybe just give us kind of your thesis on, what makes great microphones and maybe talk about applications that you see in studios that might help some of our listeners.
Okay. Now you have to forgive me if I'm a little foggy brain today. I've had like 3 hours of sleep, so but I'll do my best to be coherent. And feel free to interrupt and rein me in if I start a tangent or if I'm going over time. But any case, yeah. Basically, today we have advanced the technological precision of microphone production, things like preamplification, microphone cables. They're just ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's almost a challenge. Like you kind of have to go out of your way to get a microphone that is not usable today. If it's a decent modern microphone. I remember something a friend said to me decades ago when I was kind of starting to get really serious about higher audio production quality. And he was well into the industry at that point, and he said, any microphone's a decent microphone, and that is so much more true today than it was then. So it's really down to features that fit your needs. Right now, I'm using, I don't know how Zoom is distorting and compressing and destroying the sound, but I'm using an MKH 416 by Sennheiser, which is kind of a standard for, it's the in a world mic. And, it's, it's a boom mic that's used on television sets everywhere, and it's going into a pristine signal chain. I don't know if you can hear that again
Yeah,
because of
it
Zoom,
was
but
funny how you immediately went into voice actor mode there. It was almost like it was wild. Yes.
yeah, well, we could do that throughout the thing if you wanted to, just doing different voices. But anyway, this mic serves a specific purpose, and it's been around for a long time because I think it was kind of it was part design science and kind of a happy accident that it landed where it did in the industry because it just has certain features in the way that its proximity effect works, how well it focuses, laser focuses at a distance,
Mm.
and it's kind of a hybrid design that's really unique. But that's an example of features that you might want to look at in a microphone. You don't have to have an MKH 416 to sound great as a voice actor. And I would say, let me just draw an analogy from, if you read forums, you're gonna you're going to learn a lot of things you have to unlearn in the future because you have to get to a point in knowledge and experience in the industry to where you know how to read forums and kind of go, okay, this guy is an expert on this and this guy knows everything about that. And, it's kind of like politics or religion. There's just never agreement completely anywhere, and a lot of people know everything. So beware the experts, I guess,
Yeah. Well,
says the guy that's probably.
I'm glad you brought up the forum piece because I feel like we discuss this all the time because our members will ask questions about things or we'll consult. And I use Reddit a lot, but a
Yeah.
lot of the time I spend on Reddit is shaking my head and listening to people argue and debate over things that don't matter. and share information that's not correct. And so I'm glad that you made that point because I do believe in a forum world that we're in, a lot of time it's the enemy of not only knowing objective truth about gear, but
Right.
also this mindset that you can't make good music or good production with what you have. And I think, we'll
Right.
get into that later around some of the myths that exist in the Reddit world around, that basically hold people back from just making music with what they have.
Yeah, and it's not just Reddit. I mean, audio DIY. I think I'm saying that right. There's plenty of, Gearspace is a huge one. There's one guy I'm thinking of. I'm not going to say his name, but he's got, I mean, the most expensive stuff, and that's great. And he's well respected for what he does, and that's great. But his snobbery about, like, I mean, this is a guy that looks down on gear like a U87 or something,
Mhm.
because
Yep.
it's just not good enough for his taste, or it's too average or something. And it's just like you get to this point where it's like, what is even, is there even any science behind what you're saying? It's just
Yep.
like, I hear this and I hear that. One thing that I have to really know when it comes to physiology and neurology about hearing, I used to call myself an audiophile until I realized more and more saturation of the audiophile community has always been, oh, I hear blue and I hear red and I hear tangerine. You might as well be saying, because these are non-scientific terms and they mean different things for different people. Oh, it's warm, it's really silky, it's wide, it's deep, it has a lot of weight to it. That could mean, and does mean, completely different things to you and I. And
Mhm.
we might think we're saying the same thing, but it's kind of like, I don't know if your red looks the same as my red, and we don't
Yep.
have language sophisticated enough to communicate that. So you have to realize, if you're a drummer and you're hitting your snare drum and you don't have any ear protection in, it doesn't hurt your ears because your brain has prepared your ear canal for that. Your ear canal actually physiologically changes shape and protects your ears to some degree. Whereas the bass player is going to be not too happy with you when you start banging on the snare drum suddenly, because it's going to hurt his ears, not just startle him, because his brain hadn't prepared his ears for that. So part of what I'm saying goes into a deep discussion that I could talk about for hours. But essentially, the point is, your ear is part of your brain, and vice versa. Your ear is an extension of the brain. So if you listen to something, and we were doing a blind A/B test, and there are those documents out there where this has happened, like placebo effect, if you will. If I flipped a switch and essentially lied to you and told you the switch is hooked to these magical capacitors in the circuit for this passive crossover, and I want to see if you can tell a difference. When I flip the switch, if you know, well, first of all, that's not a blind test. I'm tricking you with the switch, but you're going to hear something different, is my point. Or if you think you're hearing something different and you're not skeptical. And there's an interesting point about skeptics. If you're skeptical, like, I think they're messing with me, you may not hear any differences. Whereas if you think you're supposed to hear a difference, oftentimes you will. And part of that is just what you could learn in ear training. If in music, in technical capacities, like in software development, if you're trained to hear certain glitches and problems in sound reproduction, like in early software, I used to have to deal with this 25 or plus years ago with early lower quality converters and CD burners and what was it, buffer underrun protection failing and creating glitches in CDs. I had to make sure that the glass master CD was glitch free before we duplicated it and stuff like that. And you just train your ear to hear these little teeny sounds. But it's that similar feature and potential and proclivity of the brain connected with the ear that we can hear these different features. So if I flipped a fake switch and said, now what do you think? Nothing's different, but you hear the song differently. If your mind's open to there's a change, you're going to be listening to different features of the song, just like you could if you were doing that intentionally. But unfortunately, you would come away thinking, okay, something is magical about this capacitor that doesn't exist. You see what I'm saying?
Mhm.
So this gear snobbery dismisses a lot of data and really um, bring on the torches and pitchforks, because I know there are gangs of people that are
Yeah.
waiting for this kind of comment so they can come after it. But it's like a data sheet that is accurate. Now, there are plenty of companies that fudge the numbers and they're not accurate. They'll say, "Oh, this has 130 decibels of dynamic range in the converters," and it's actually like more like 111. There's a big difference there, but you're still not going to hear it. The human ear, I forget what it is exactly, can hear like at best maybe into the 90s of decibels of depth, and most of the time we won't notice what's going on there. Kind of like you may be able to hear 20 kilohertz, but you're not going to hear it in a song, because it'll be drowned out by everything else. Not to say that that couldn't give you some cues for transient response in the highest end systems, but blah, blah, blah. Any case, my point is dismissing data is a problem. Because if you have good data on a device, um, it can really tell you a lot about its performance, and you can know what to expect or how to correct or shape it the way that you want it to be. So if you were to buy a microphone that was not your end goal, say you got a Rode NT1 4th gen or 5th gen, that's a great microphone. I know that there's a lot of hatred for that mic from Snobbery, but
But it's
there's reason.
accessible. It's
Yeah,
accessible. And I think that that's one of the things that makes it great is that an average person can easily access that and make some pretty good sounds with it.
and it's also in Disney voiceover studios and others if you don't like Disney. But I mean, there's a reason for that. Um, but the great thing about an NT1 that I think a lot of people dismiss if they're too good for it is not only is it a fantastic microphone with a linear circuit, really low self noise, despite claims from some experts in the field like Klaus Hein. I don't name drop anybody that I work with. I never name drop clients. I don't know Klaus Hein. I'm not trying to give him a bad name. He's very knowledgeable. He mods U87s a lot. He's very well known for that. But uh, he talks about lossy signal quality in microphones that use a lot of transistors to achieve a lower noise floor. And perhaps he knows much more about that than I do, and I'm missing something. But in my experience, an NT1, if you know what you're doing, can be made to sound just as good as any other large dynamic condenser microphone in cardioid as you would want. I mean, it's all there. What he deems as lossy, I'm not really sure. He could be measuring something that's true, and maybe I'll figure that out later. But at the end of the day, the point is the only thing that I can see with the NT1 that's significantly different, from a much more expensive microphone. I mean, obviously there's a lot of things, but the NT1 is going to sound better in a bedroom, for example, than a U87, because the U87 has a wide off-axis response that is colored in different ways, so you can kind of EQ at the mic, whereas the NT1, yes, it does that naturally. It's part of the physics of the capacitor microphone, but it's made more so that the off-axis response really falls off, so it's not picking up all these mid-range frequencies so much from the sides of the mic. So you really should address it, whether you move it to the side of your mouth to get different sounds or whatever. It really needs to be pointing at the source as much as possible. So it may not make for as good of a drum overhead, perhaps, because it's focusing more in front of itself, kind of like it may be a flood light instead of a spotlight. But for voiceover and stuff like that, it's a great microphone. So sorry, I feel like I've taken a bunch of tangents, but am I sort of addressing?
Yeah, what I like us getting into here is applications of mics. And you said something that was very shocking to me, which was, an NT1 in a bedroom could sound as good, if not better, than a U87 because of the environment you're using it in and the way that you may be using it. What would you tell some listeners who are early in their journey to discover microphones around how they should approach testing and listening to different mics in what would be more of an average application. Let's take a home studio or even a bedroom studio. How would you start to use audio science to direct someone to, make good decisions about gear?
Um, I would start off with something that works for your, well, I would say make a budget, not just the money you have in your pocket right now. Okay? But make a budget, make a plan that's reasonable. Starting out with an NT1 would be great because I mean, it comes with a shock mount, a pop filter, a cable with a cable tie, the mic. It's pretty much everything except your interface and your computer. And obviously a stand, which you can pick up a on-stage stand for what, $20 or something on Amazon, or from BuyOrBorrow Music, they might have them there. I don't know. Sorry, I don't know if you guys sell mic stands,
We
but
do. Yeah, we have the
um,
we have the on-stage booms.
check with Dave. He'll hook you up. But yeah, I mean, I'm not just recommending that mic. I'm just saying pick out a package that has the features that you want. If you're going to be creating more digital music, you may, like EDM and stuff like that, you may just want to get you could go with an SM57, or I'm going to throw some things out there that are really low budget but work really well. Pyle makes a mic. I think it's called the PD Mic 78 or something like that. And it's basically, you can find them on Parts Express, I know, and there's different places. And I used to just roll my eyes at Pyle. But if you can fully overcome snobbery and say, like, I'm not going to mess with said brand, you find that there's actually some really great stuff out there. And what's great about those mics is they're about $11 a piece. At one
Wow.
point, I bought 10 of them for $100. So I bought 10 of these mics that are basically exactly an SM57 without a transformer. So it's more sensitive. And the only problem with the mic, potentially, is that the cable inside is really, really thin. So for fun and being absolutely an absurd person like I am, I just took them apart and I put 14 gauge wire. This is beyond ridiculous. I put 14 gauge wire, and I was laughing the whole time I did it. But I put 14 gauge wire in 5 of them, and I just opened the other 5 up to make sure the polarity was right and it was grounded properly. And I was like, okay, good. They were all great. They've got a handle on that. They used to have some wiring issues, but they've listened to the community and fixed it. So for the price of one SM57, you've got 10 microphones that sound just as good and have a similar character, but debatably are more clear and less colored because the transformer isn't in there.
Hmm.
Um, and the 14 gauge wire did make a difference. It did actually
Really?
have a wider frequency bandwidth. It had, I noticed, more lows and more pronounced clarity in the highs, but that's absurd. And it's really hard to do because when you're screwing the mic back together, it's going to be difficult not to break
The
something
coiled
with
wire. Yeah, yeah.
you've
Yeah.
got a giant, 14 gauge is just
Yeah.
ridiculous.
But that's
I
pretty heavy duty wire to stick in a mic.
Yeah, I had that lying around 99.97% OFC oxygen free copper because I was building a bunch of speakers and I was in my lab and I was like, why don't I just do this to be ridiculous and see what
Yeah.
happens if there's any difference, because I try things like that just because it's like, I actually, I've tried running a subwoofer with one piece of the strand of a 14 gauge wire that I was working with. And I just wanted to see, will it burn the strand up? What will happen with physical compression at a high amplitude if I just take the positive terminal and just run one, what is that, like 30 gauge
Hmm.
little tiny hair of wire? And it was quite a significant, it's just little experiments like that. I mean, one thing I used to tell my dad when I was trying to teach him to use computers is be adventurous. Don't be afraid of breaking things. Given that you're not throwing your microphone on the floor or submerging it in water, carrying it out in the rain with you, like you're not going to break it. Just experiment, be experimental. But to get to the core of your question, really look for the features that you want. Now, I'll name some brands other than these Pyle mics, but like if you were doing mostly EDM, that'd be more than enough to, snap your fingers, clap your hands, tap on things, wrinkle a can, whatever you wanted to do for sound design. And even if you ended up getting a better recorder eventually, you could still record in high resolution with that. And if you wanted to upgrade, you can obviously do that. But if you haven't and you want to get into DIY stuff, definitely for microphones, check out Mic Parts or Microphone Parts. Matt McGlynn owns that company and Roswell Pro Audio. If you want some really boutique, lovely sounding mics, Roswell is excellent. And there's a little known secret in the audio world called 3U Audio. They make some really great mics, and I swear they've taken the circuit from like Neumann's and classic AKGs and basically redone it. And it's excuse me, it's got the authentic sound. You can get multi-pattern mics or mics that just have different voicings on them or both. And basically it's kind of like having three U87s in one, and their prices are like the 3U MK1 Warbler is a cardioid only 3-voice, has a 10 dB pad and a low cut filter, and it's $299.
Wow.
Yeah, you can check out 3U's website. He only sells through email or eBay, and you can find his eBay store or email him from his website. He doesn't sell on the website, and I suspect it's possibly because of the small operation and also because he might be trying to not be a big enterprise that gets in trouble with Neumann's attorneys like Rode did with the NT2 snafu, if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, I'm
And
sure.
if you're not, there's some fun history there between the NT2 and the B2 from Behringer.
Well,
Basically,
yeah,
they're
I
the
mean,
same mic.
well, I mean, and you think about all the things that Behringer's redoing. In fact, that is a Behringer Poly D right over my shoulder, which,
Nice.
it's a really decent recreation of a nice old analog synth, right?
Yeah.
So let's dig further into, you don't have to necessarily get a Neumann to get the effect that you would want from a piece of gear like that. I know
Right.
you and I have talked a lot about warm audio and the
Yeah.
W87 and just the quality in general of warm audio overall. So two-part question. Number one, what's your take on the warm audio series? It's been a hit here at Buy or Borrow. And then follow-up question is, how have you gone about modifying some of that gear and building even some of your own mics to mimic some of these really high-end sounds of mics that you may have dreamed about?
Yeah. Well, warm. Just to say, like, I'm not. I don't I have eccentric ways of thinking about almost everything if you get into it deep enough. And one of those is I'm not a fan of anything or anybody because that word comes from fanatic. And I like to at least hope that I'm not fanatical about anything. So I'm not a fanboy, and I'm not just trying to use different words to say the same thing. But I have become an avid user of Worms gear, and I in my own personal studio that I'm mostly working in now because of my health and working remotely. I pretty much my outboard gear is mostly Warm because I love their and I got a few of these units from you, Dave. Thanks. But the basically I frequently use this as a stack, and I kind of think of it as a channel strip, like a dream channel strip. Like when I've worked extensively in commercial studios and things, we'd either have like an sought after API or Neve board, and we would be able to interchange different EQs or preamps into some of these boards. Some of them were broadcast and very modular, very easy to take them out. And they were old too, so sometimes you'd have to fidget with things and this isn't working, pull it out and put another one in. But I kind of think it as the dream channel, and I now record my vocals going into that to get it's basically, I'm just going to say the originals, but they're warm. 1073 into EQP1A into 1176 into LA2A. And through that, I get the saturation I want. And when I'm using, now, I will talk about the gear, not the ear, myth slash truth, because there's a balancing act there. Why do you see guys in multi-million-dollar facilities saying that? Why do they have all that gear if that's true? Not to say, because I have seen people with a rickety thing 20 years ago and an SM57 record stuff that blows my mind. But not everybody is either that lucky or talented or whatever it is. And our tools really do help us out. So the warm rack gear, to try to get to your point and try to rein myself in from all these tangent flags, the warm audio gear is great, and they started in the space of trying to recreate and make affordable for themselves and then others. Bryce over there, units that are very sought after, and they just expanded that, got to know people in the industry. It's pretty legit. And as far as modding warm, I haven't had to mod any of the warm products that I've gotten because in my experience, as it comes to plugins, choose whichever one's feature set you like better, because they're all going to sound a little bit different, but they're all good. Like if they're legitimate companies, like I've seen on forums people say like, oh, you have to get UAD because they're the people that manufactured these products back in the day and they know what they're doing. What planet are you living on? Like the tech team that's doing these algorithmic runs have nothing to do and are probably of one or two generations apart from the people that designed the original units. And while some of these original people or the people that own them, like Chrysalid Algae or someone, may be part of the modeling, that's Waves actually. Like that has nothing to do with the plugin that you get on the back end of this whole process. So what I'm saying is the people that are doing this are very passionate about the sound. They're very serious about making a good product that's going to stand up to all the scrutiny. And so choose your medicine. They're all good. Whether you go Slate, Waves, UA, whatever. And the reason I'm saying this is, for me, IK Multimedia's T-Rax Max bundle is great for a lot of that vintage modeling. But if I take my physical stack of warm units and I do the same sound, which is going to be slightly different settings probably, but whether you copy the settings or just work for that sound in the box and out of the box, it's always going to sound better through the analog units. So recording through the warm stack, excellent. And warm obviously makes great, I would say, inspired by microphones. Like I haven't, full disclosure on this, I haven't used their latest mics. I haven't used their revision
They're
of
R2, right? Like the WA
yeah, the
R2.
WA87 R2. I haven't used that. I think they went with the, in my opinion, less attractive design because they probably got a little bit of disturbance in the force from Neumann's attorneys.
Yeah. Around the shape of the head and
yeah. And there's a reason for that, and it does have to do with acoustics, and it was a very important patent that Georg Neumann made back in the day. But yeah, don't you can't shape your head basket and your capsule deck like a U87, or you'll probably get a phone call that you won't want. But yeah, they supposedly flattened out the frequency response a little bit more. There were some interesting anomalies that gave characteristic to the original line of the WA87s, which you got a pair from me, and they were really cool for that. But it was something that made them distinct from their inspiration. And so I guess what I'm saying is, like, you do have the sound there, the characteristics, and it's definitely inspired by these microphones. And as they keep going, they're really hamming it up with, I mean, I think they've got like the Elam 251 and the C12 and the Sony C800G basically, and the the sadly departed Neumann KM84. You
Mhm.
know, like they've got a lot of things to fill these gaps, and they're very affordable and they're very usable across the spectrum. So those are very accessible mics. And I think my favorite one um, that that I had from them was probably actually the WA14. I really liked that
Mhm.
mic. It was transparent, it had a little bit of character, but it was a nice recreation of the vintage C414. Um, but yeah, it's onto the modding. You know, I found. I mean, it kind of goes back to when I was a kid. I was always, you know, tearing something apart, see how it worked. I would put different things together and make a stereo system out of part car stereo, part 8-track tape, you know, parts, and take the motor out of this and make a fan with it for no reason. I just, you know, I already had a stereo. I was just goofing around to see what I could make, and I broke more things than I made back then, you know, but you know, eventually you start going like, okay, you know, I've got this cheap, you know, MXL 990 here. It would make a good donor body. What parts can I get? And that's a cool thing
Mhm.
about a resource. For example, if you're starting out in this, even if you want to go your own direction, like I did, I didn't really normally do kits. I just kind of went like, yeah, those kits exist and that's good, but I want to create something original and unique. So I would take parts from when Mic Parts was starting out. They had capsules that they had quality controlled that are basically like the RK47, RK87, the CK12. That's their version of like the K87, K47, CK12 mic capsules that you know from the U87, the U47, the C12, and ELAM 251. Those kind of capsules you can get at a third, half the price as if you bought them from Neumann. And they're pretty spot on. I mean, it's not as difficult for someone that has the tools to build those as you would think, because the drilling pattern is the same, the tension is the same. It's kind of like tuning a drum, the way the tension ring goes around the diaphragm that's in gold sputtered, and whether it's side or center terminated, you know, that sort of thing. I don't build capsules. I just kind of know some about how they're built.
Mhm.
But quality control is what's really important, and they do that job for you over there. And so I just started, you know, kind of building my own mics, and then if I took parts, I might take circuit design from this guy has a good idea and this guy has a good idea. I put these circuits together, and I took a vintage U67 that was just pretty much demolished, sadly, and found machine parts to replace what wasn't there. Got a circuit design together that worked, and instead of going with a tube design, I wanted to put an XLR in it and simulate the tube saturation, which we could talk about what saturation is. That's a whole thing. But kind of get that flavor, if you will, from the transformer in the circuit instead of a tube, and then capsule my own diffraction resistance design inside of the capsule deck to kind of diffraction is basically where sound hits a surface. It's kind of reflectivity that you don't want. So in a speaker, it would be like screws could cause diffraction, but you see rounded and beveled edges of speakers, especially around the mid-range and the tweeter, because they're trying to let the waveform fall off naturally instead of hitting a flat surface and going off of a hard edge. You get what I've heard some people refer to as little speakers build up on that surface, and they're reflecting a distortion in the sound wave that's going to change the frequency response. And the same thing happens inside the acoustics. If you think about it from the perspective of if you're a mic capsule and your world is the capsule deck that you're and the pedestal that you're on, and the environment of the head basket, that's drastically going to change your world. So that is very much to be considered heavily in any design. And anyway, I hope I I hope I somewhat answered your question. I feel like I'm tangenting too much because of my lack of sleep. I hope it's helpful.
Well, it's what it makes me want to do is spend a day in your lab because I'm sure that it would be fun to see all these things in practice. There's something you did talk about I want to zoom in on, and in this last little bit of time we've got here. You started talking about, your analog signal chain,
Yeah.
particularly with your warm setup, and you've got the sort of the Pultec clone into the 1176 clone into the LA2A clone. I feel like one thing that we talk about a lot on these episodes that people just can't wrap their heads around is compression and
Mm,
how to properly use compression. We've had some
yeah.
folks on here that have talked about it from like a guitar perspective and things like that, but I know you have probably spent more time with this with vocals and audio, like voice production. Can you talk to us a little bit about the science you see behind compression and how a vocalist might approach setting up the compression in their signal chain?
It really depends on what you're doing, like your genre. I sing anything from, you know, somewhat classical to indie rock, Americana to power metal vocals. And when I'm doing power metal vocals, it's a very different beast.
Mhm.
But um I can't, I'm not going to get try to give out specific settings here, but basically what you want to do is create something that is going to be pretty fast in creating warmth in your vocals. There may be times when you want transients to come out, but generally in the commercial world, your transients should kind of be shaped into the character of the sound. And that can happen with speed, which is one thing that the 1176 is great at. It's
Yep.
one of the fastest compressors in the world.
What
So
is the
regardless,
millisecond range on that? Is it down to like 6 or 7 milliseconds? I can't. Much better than
I think they're measured mostly in microseconds. So
I'm
if you
sorry,
went to
microseconds.
milliseconds, I think it's 800 microseconds down to, I want to say, 20 microseconds. So
Mhm.
that's, I'm going to say this wrong, I'm sure, zero point zero 0.08 or possibly zero point 0.8 milliseconds, I think is the slowest that the attack occurs.
Mhm.
And having the release, I find on 1176s and the WA76, I pretty much keep my release on fastest all the time because I think that's where the magic is with that unit or units like it that are made very well like it. Um, with the two stages there, what you're getting is two different types of character, right? You're getting transformer and fet warmth mixed with, and that speed mixed with a slower, that optical compression that's just really, it's got such a unique sound. And there's also tubes in that unit that warm up your signal, which we don't really have time to get in today, unfortunately. But I was going to talk some about saturation and what that means because it's a non-scientific term that really branches out. Like, what are you talking about?
Mhm.
Tape saturation.
Yeah.
That could be wow, that could be flutter, that could be noise, that could be different types of distortion, harmonic distortion. When you think of harmonic distortion, you're thinking of like when you play, if you hold down a C dominant 7 chord and you just silently hold that down on an acoustic piano, and some models that are made really well, and you strike C1, you know, you're going to hear resonances through those notes more so than you would if you just laid your arm on the piano and you hear general reverb.
Mhm.
Um, Kind of in those rows of the overtone series, you get that with distortion, which is what can make bass guitar come out in a little speaker. You can hear it in your iPhone, for example, without being amplified by anything else because the mixing process, somebody used saturation, if you will, which is in that case another name for harmonic distortion. So, which the pleasant one we like is even order, especially second order harmonic distortion is very musical. But anyway, yeah, sorry, I kind of lost track of honestly what you asked me. I was trying to answer your
No,
question.
it's just it always blows my mind how much science there is behind it. And I know enough to be dangerous to myself about even order. I know everyone always talks about second order. I don't know that I really could have the ears to understand where that falls, but that's one thing I think a lot of people don't realize about compression is that there is an element of saturation that you're bringing in to your mix with using compression in
Yeah,
that sort of semblance. And I've always, like as a guitar player, I've always loved the sound of an 1176 on an
Mm.
electric guitar track. And it's to me, it's almost like when you turn it on, even with really not much going on, whatever comes out of it is going to sound at least 2x better than what went into it. It's
That
just
new warm
something.
pedal. I'm sure you'll be checking that out.
Oh yeah, that's well, I'll tell you the one that I'm actually the most jazzed about is the Origin Effects.
Oh,
Their
okay.
FET,
Yeah.
they're the new one. It's the Cali 76 FET.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Is
yeah, yeah.
killer. Oh my gosh, it's killer. And they put the LED gain dB reduction meter on the front now, so you can
Right.
actually see it visually. Because I'm one of those guys that likes to use my eyes and my ears,
Yeah.
probably because some of placebo there.
Yeah.
But the 1176 to me is just it just sounds so good, and I love that fast response in it. The
Yeah.
LA2A is also awesome as well.
Yeah.
And I've seen, I have a friend that runs a studio here in town, and watching that come to life like on a vocal track in
Right.
different stages of compression. Um,
Right. And that's what I missed in answering your question. Don't be afraid to put too much compression on. I often find that I'm compressing like I have gain reduction of like 14 dB, sometimes higher, going with the two compressors doing different things at different speeds. You know, if you did that all with one compressor, it'd have to be a really, really, really lush and lovely compressor.
yeah.
There are models out there of like the Fairchild, for example. It does a great job of smashing things musically, but you can get similar and dare I say even better effects with hardware when you're doing something like this, and you're getting that speed to control the transients and keep everything in shape, and then you're getting this more, I don't want to say loose, but you're getting this kind of a hug by the by the LA2A.
That's
That
the way to put it.
yeah,
And from what I've heard, and again, everyone has a different language, and
right.
LA2A does sound like a warm hug. It's the
Yeah,
best
yeah.
way I could hear it described.
Yep. Excuse me. And it really that process. What these are Neumann NDH 20s, and the reason I mention that is because when I'm singing power metal, especially, I have these on. I struggled for well over a decade trying to find. Okay, eventually I got tired of. And this is another thing of picking a microphone. You know, pick a microphone that works for your features, and you can any decent microphone today is going to be is pretty much anyone that I've mentioned, or even less expensive, as long as it's from a decent brand, has decent reviews. You know, talk to Dave and he'll help you find one too. But you know, any of those mics are going to have low noise floors, low self noise, low harmonic distortion, high SPL handling. That's really all you need. And for a vocal, I would recommend a large diaphragm condenser. In some cases, you know, if you're podcasting, definitely something like an SM7B, which is a
Mhm.
large diaphragm dynamic. It's
Yeah.
basically a headphone inside of a microphone, headphone driver. But any case, what I'm saying is those mics can have the character, or at least the profile, which is 90% to at the end of a mix, really 99+% of what you're hearing at the end. So if you have a controlled environment where you can borrow a U87, shoot some pink noise through it, and then do the same exact thing with the mic you own, you can actually take something like IK Multimedia's Master Match and match those frequency responses. And you're going to get 85-90% of the sound profile of the U87. You're not going to have the transient control of the circuit and the FET that's in there and the transformer, but most of that's going to happen when you start compressing properly. And when you put it in the mix, you're going to trick some engineers that are well experienced and think that sounds really good, you know, or that, what mic do you think I used? U87? Nope. It was a fill in the blank, you know.
Yeah.
But my point is like you can also do that by looking at frequency response charts as long as they're accurate, and kind of curtailing it. But any case, that's one thing that I wanted to say so that people kind of have an idea of picking something for their features, what works for them. But at this point, I kind of came to the point where I was like, I want the mic to. This is something that you can eventually work toward. I want the mic to sound the way I want it to sound when I sing into it. And I had known from my time in the industry, I'm pretty sure the U87 was the sound that I keep going for. So I ended up, you know, getting one from you because it's like, that's it. And I'm not even using the EQP1A for anything but its
Wow.
character. It's tube character. I crank the gain output from the 1073 essentially into it and let that saturate the tubes in there, and that harmonic distortion comes through and just really makes it beautiful. So basically what I have going in, and this is the boldness that you'll eventually develop with experience, is printing to tape a radio ready signal. All I need to do now is add, you know, reverb, delay, some width for choruses, and other than that, it's ready to go. And if I need to melodyne and tweak a couple little things, I can do that. But yeah,
No, there's
building your signal chain.
no fixing in post
Right, right.
with that sort of setup, which there is a
Yeah,
lot to
and
be
I
said
mean,
for.
like, if you needed to add some more air or something, you can do that, you know. And you'll hear things like, "Oh, you can't EQ that because it messes up the phase." Well, I got news for you. A U87, $4,000 microphone, brand new, has an EQ in it. That's what the filter capacitor that pulls down the harsh sound that is designed into the K87 capsule. That's what it does. That capsule naturally has a huge, I think, 8 decibel peak, about 10 kilohertz, which is the sibilant sound that a lot of people complain about in mics that are designed with a perfect copy of the capsule but a linear circuit. If they had a filter capacitor in it to pull that down, it would sound a lot more like a U87. So yeah, EQ is fine, and
It's
it
not your
doesn't.
enemy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And nobody's ever said, "Oh, I'm not going to put U87s as drum overheads with all these other mics because it'll throw things out of phase." That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
You never hear anybody say that. Same thing applies if you record a drum set, everything's set up right, and you EQ things. You're going to EQ it anyway. You're probably going to high pass to a good degree your overheads with a drum recording anyhow. But yeah, I'm sorry I've rambled so much. I'm just trying to tie it together and say, if you're starting out, if you're exploring gear, BuyOrBorrow is a great place to. He didn't ask me to plug anything. I'm just thinking practically here. BuyOrBorrow is a great place to find your sound and experiment. Don't be afraid to experiment, and don't be afraid to experiment with things that don't cost so much. Now, what I brought up earlier, and I want to hold through to my promise of answering this a little bit at least, is it's the ear, not the gear. There's truth to that, but there's also a reason why we have really nice tools, because you need to be able to trust your equipment to be reliable. If you're working constantly, things shouldn't be breaking right and left. Things shouldn't be, which, you know, Rode and cheaper stuff, I'm not saying that cheaper in price, I'm not saying that it's going to break. I'm just saying, you know, I'm saying like a Neumann U87 is always going to sound the same as a Neumann U87. It's always going to work when you need it to work. Mogami cables, like the one I have hooked up here, it's going to work. You know, like they're more expensive tools, but they're in the industry because you put a lot of force on them, you put a lot of work through it, you know. And when you're mixing speakers, maybe we can talk about this another time. That's a whole passion of mine as well, speakers and acoustics and all of that. Being able to hear the full spectrum, especially given a treated room, and hearing the low end properly is very important. And having a couple different sources at least, so that, you know, maybe you've got like a trash reference, for example, or a couple, like, I think the ideal thing is to have like a very high end full range system that you work mostly on, maybe some good headphones, and then like some NS10s or CLA 10s, and then like one mono mix cube. And that way you can hear excellent, full, you know, best sound quality imaginable, something really harsh that's going to make those things that, whoops, I didn't notice that, stand out to you. And then the mono sum playing through a really deliberately garbage speaker. That's a tool, you know, to show you, oh gosh, I didn't realize that the stereo width on this was causing cancellation and making this sound smaller. Because it's a myth to say that mono doesn't have depth, soundstage, and imaging, because it does. There are layers there. So mono is not dead. It's an important tool, and it's also what you're going to hear in a store, on some phones, on some Bluetooth speakers. If you get far enough from a stereo system, or even in your car is just a jumbled mess of chaos. The acoustics in there are really bad, even in the best cars. You don't have a phantom center image, you're normally sitting off to the side somewhere, but we have a lot of fun listening to that stuff. So anyway, have fun, experiment, find your sound, and yeah, don't be afraid of that stuff, and don't buy anybody's saying, oh, you have to do this or you can never do that, or professionals will always fill in the blank. I think seasoned engineers know that there's no right answer to everything. Like, one thing is not going to solve everything. There's a 10-hour, and I could link you to this later if you're interested. There's a 10-hour explanation of compression on YouTube, and it's a great resource. It's a true masterclass in compression. So answering questions about compression is really hard in a quick
Yeah, compression
quick way.
compression is a black box, in so many ways. I would
Yeah,
love to have the link. We'll put it in the show notes here and the links in the videos, and I think that's a great place to pick up for round two because I would love to come back and talk about speakers, talk about imaging, and then
yeah,
also maybe a deeper dive on compression because it's again, I feel like it's one of those things that just people don't really understand, both from the practical application, but also just how important it is into everything that we do. So.
definitely.
Well, listen, Jesse, man, this has been fantastic. I could sit here and continue to geek out for quite a while, but
Same here.
we would love to have you back for another episode and to dive a little bit further into to some of those other topics. So,
Okay.
the one thing I would love to wrap up with, and I say this a lot, back to your point, the ear, not the gear, but there's a reason we have gear. It's this whole existential balance of duality.
Yeah.
But one thing I love, I heard this quote years ago. It was a great hammer will not make a great carpenter, but a
Mm,
great carpenter will always want a great hammer. And I thought
yeah.
that was so befitting, right? It's like, you could go out and buy the best stuff, but if you don't have the chops and the understanding and the ears, it's not going to do you any good. But vis-a-vis that, a great carpenter can still make good stuff with an
Yeah.
average hammer. So it is a balance, but I do think it's one of those blockers that so many people have to just going out and getting started. I would always
Yeah.
rather see someone to get out there, make some art, get inspired with whatever you have, and then grow into these other things. And I think you've done a great job of summing that up. So
Well,
thank you
thank
so
you.
much for joining us today, man. It's been a real
Absolutely.
pleasure, and I hope to have you back soon for round two.
Yeah. I look forward to it. Thanks a lot.